So we got a nice Oberst question from Northfield, namely, why was aerial interdiction so effective on the Western Front in 1944 compared to the Eastern Front? So first off, a short definition on aerial interdiction, usually called just interdiction in this video. Simply put, it is about isolating the enemy forces from supplies and reinforcements, or in other words, the delay, disruption or destruction of enemy forces or supplies en route to the battle area. As mentioned previously in videos about air power comparison between the Eastern and Western Front in terms of air war, the Germans had a hard time moving anything behind the lines during daylight even in summer 44, whereas on the Eastern Front this was still possible in 1945, as pointed out by Krefeld. Even in 1945, when the Soviet air superiority had become much greater, the contrast between air superiority in the East and West was sharp. Western air forces were able to dominate the sky to such an extent that supply routes were practically impassable for German columns during daylight. On the Eastern Front, German supply traffic in the rear areas proceeded almost undisturbed. Yet the question is, why was this the case? And reading up on this, I came across some interesting points made by various authors. And one includes that Soviet partisans might have had an indirect influence on this. Yet let's start with the first major factor: geography and the major powers. Germany and the Soviet Union were continental powers, whereas the United States and Britain were not. Now you might say, well, that's pretty obvious, yet it has a fundamental impact on the thinking, organization, strategy, doctrine and many other aspects of the armed forces and of course the air forces as well. Why? Well, simply put, whereas the United States and Britain can think about how they fight a war when it breaks out, both the Germans and the Soviets will likely be engaged by the enemy on their own soil immediately. This also means that the air forces of continental powers are usually more focused on directly supporting the army with close air support instead of indirectly supporting it with interdiction strikes. The air force of a continental power expecting to fight continental wars cannot rationally ignore the necessity of supporting the war on the ground, where victory or defeat can come with both swiftness and finality. As such, continental powers usually focus more on close air support than on aerial interdiction, since time and space are usually scarcer. Of course, there's also the fundamental debate if it makes more sense to destroy the enemy en route to the battlefield or on the battlefield itself. Senior air commanders often argue that deeper missions can have a greater impact on the theater operations by destroying enemy forces and supplies before they can engage or maneuver against friendly forces. Hence, the difference in doctrine are often a reflection of the geostrategic position of the countries involved. Quite unsurprisingly, Britain and the United States are known for strategic bombing in World War II, whereas Germany and the Soviet Union are known for close air support. Germany with the Stuka dive bomber and the Soviet Union with the IL-2. Although other nations discussed close air support, only the Soviets put in the effort to develop a purpose-built aircraft for the job. The thoroughly successful and massively produced IL-2 Stormovik. The Soviets put in the effort to see the project to success precisely because the desired end product closely matched their perceptions of their needs. Yet let's move from the general geography down to the more practical geography, namely the front lines. And again, here we have a very different situation on both sides. Since summer 1941, the Soviets had a direct front line with the Wehrmacht on their own soil. And this is where the partisans come in, because interdiction is about the delay, disruption or destruction of enemy forces or supplies en route to the battle area. And the Soviet partisans did exactly that. As such, Starrett points out the following. Admittedly, until they expelled the Axis from the Soviet Union in 1944, the Soviets could ignore air interdiction because partisans' raids provided the Soviets with an alternative source of interdiction. A point I never came across before, which of course raises the question how effective partisans were compared to aerial interdiction. But this is a bit too much for this video. Yet it is without doubt that the Germans invested resources in anti-partisans operations, as pointed out by Roman Töppel, that were significant. A number of divisions scheduled to take part in Operation Citadel, namely the 4th Panzer Division, the 18th Panzer Division, the 10th Motorized Infantry Division, the 7th Infantry Division and the 292nd Infantry Division were involved in this anti-partisan operation. The deployment of these formations shows how dangerous the Germans considered the partisans in the rear of the Army Group Center to be, particularly because the Bryansk railway junction was vital for the supply of Army Group Center. Now another aspect of the front lines is of course the difference in space. For this we look at the length of the front lines. And for this we use a primary source, namely a study of the German Army General Staff on July 1944 comparing the situation to 1917. It notes 151 kilometers for the Invasionsfront, so Normandy, and 281 kilometers for the front line in Italy. Whereas for the Eastern Front it notes 2,720 kilometers without the coastal area and the front line of the 20th Mountain Army, which was stationed in northern Finland. Hence, if we just add the Western Allied front lines, we have 432 kilometers in contrast to 2,720 kilometers on the Eastern Front, which is a ratio of almost 6.3 to 1. Of course, interdiction happens in the rear areas behind the front lines, so this is only a small approximation, but you can see there was a serious difference in the space. As such, the space to force ratio on the Eastern Front and Western Front was quite different, and the Western Allies could put way more aircraft into one location than the Soviets could in the Eastern Front. Similarly, the Allies had far less boots on the ground, or for the Western Front for a long time they had no boots on the ground at all. As such, their main combat contribution was by air attack, and since you need boots on the ground for close air support missions, they had to focus on interdiction and strategic bombing. As such, they had far more experience in these types of mission when they finally invaded Normandy. So they had experience bonus and everything, whereas for the Soviets it was basically the other way around. This of course is also related to the air superiority achieved by the Western Allies, which reached levels that are often compared to air supremacy. Air units of the Western Allies were in evidence at all times of the day, in all combat areas and over Germany. The Soviets endeavored only to achieve and maintain air superiority at and near the front and to destroy the German frontline army units. Whereas on the Eastern Front the Germans sometimes were able to achieve local air superiority for a short while, this was not the case in the West anymore, where the Luftwaffe was even denied local air superiority. This was due to the fact that the Luftwaffe was worn down in a long attritional battle against the Allied bomber offensive, thus very limited numbers were in the Normandy region, something that military aviation history discusses in his video about the Luftwaffe during D-Day. In addition to repeatedly bombing air bases that showed signs of repairs, the Allies standing patrols over those bases closest to the bridgehead to prevent them from generating sorties. The defenders were forced to operate out of bases in the Paris area and even further back. This also led to the issue that the Luftwaffe's recon missions became more sporadic, whereas on the Allied side this was the opposite. While denying effective and frequent air reconnaissance to the enemy, air mastery enabled the Allies to obtain timely intelligence at great depth. This knowledge of German troop movements and the positions allowed the Allies to strike more effectively and efficiently. Additionally, their reaction times were also reduced, thus the chances of intercepting movements improved as well. Now the major aspect is that the Western Allies put a deep focus on interdiction. What do I mean with that? Well, they had the so-called transportation plan, which meant a sustained attack on the railway system in France and Belgium. As such, aerial interdiction was not only on the operational but also on the strategic level. The transportation plan focused on railway marshalling yards and especially repair centers. The goal was to destroy locomotives and rolling stock en masse and thereby disrupt, reduce and canalize rail activity and prevent its regeneration, creating a railway desert. These strategic air attacks would be complemented by the destruction of bridges by medium and fighter bombers and the strafing of trains to further reduce capacity. These sustained attacks that happened before and after the invasion in Normandy also led to a cascading effect. What do I mean with that? Well, you destroy a railway line, it gets repaired. But meanwhile the enemy has to either divert the traffic or keep it waiting. Yet the Western Allies also attacked the road, the bridges, the depots and so on. As a result, the infrastructure was under constant attack and everything was wearing down over time. Since capacity of the lines and roads was dropping, similarly locomotives, rolling stock and other vehicles were reduced as well. As Dieter Ose points out, the loss of transport connections, the constantly decreasing transport capacity and the shortage of fuel, which had already given cause to concern before the invasion and made it impossible for the units to move fully, became increasingly apparent. To summarize, aerial interdiction on the Western Front in 1944 was so effective due to a multitude of factors. First was the geographical situation that influenced the doctrine of the air forces. For instance, continental powers like Germany and the Soviet Union focused on close air support instead of interdiction and strategic bombing. Second, the geography also influenced the space-to-force ratio. On the Western Front, the front lines were way shorter, as such interdiction could cover a far higher percentage of the rear area with similar forces. Additionally, since the Soviets were constantly engaged in ground combat, close air support had a higher priority, whereas the Western Allies had for a long time no boots on the ground. As such, they had to focus on air attacks, which also led to an increase in experience in this area. Third, the Allies achieved air superiority or even air supremacy, as such denying the Luftwaffe sometimes even recon missions, whereas at the same time Allied bombing and recon sorties were mostly unmolested and thus benefited from increased effectiveness and efficiency. Fourth, the Western Allies also put a strong focus on interdiction on the strategic level with the transportation plan, by engaging the railway system and following up on the operational level with attacks on bridges, roads and troop movements. Which also leads to the fifth point, that the continuous and sustained attack also had a cascading effect that decreased the overall effectiveness of the infrastructure and German supply system. Thank you here to Northfield and all other Patreons for supporting me. Also big thank you to all supporters on Subscribestar. Thank you to Military Aviation History for reviewing the script, and special thanks to Czech for sending me the Decisive and Indecisive military operations series, and Roman for the book on Kursk. I hope you enjoyed this episode, thank you for watching and see you next time.